Hi everybody, it's Jared Goff here from Missio Scotland, and I am here with another We Are Mission podcast, and I'm delighted to be joined by Fr John McFadden, who is a Spiritan Father here in Carfin. Fr John, thanks very much for agreeing to come on We Are Mission. So, Fr John, for people who don't know you, can you tell us a wee bit about your background, where you grew up, your schools and so on?
Yes, my family are originally from Greenock. My mother and father, both Greenockians, and my father worked in the shipyards, but then around about 1950, work was a bit low, so he got the promise of a job in the Midlands in England, in Derby, with Rolls-Royce. So they moved there, and I happened to be born when they were in Derby. So that's where I was born, but then they moved to Leicestershire, where there was another Rolls-Royce factory where my father worked for the next 35 years. So I was brought up in Leicestershire, in the kind of rural Leicestershire, really. My mother and father, of course, were very devout Catholics, had a strong faith, since the communities they both came from in Greenock were, strong church-going families. And growing up as a young child, the Catholic faith was just taken for granted, even though we were in a very non-Catholic part of Britain. Leicestershire was the number of Catholics there was very small, although there was a very good parish quite near, within walking distance of our home. So we had the Rosminian Fathers as our priests. They were members of an Italian congregation that came to Britain in the 1840s, in what they call the Second Spring, when there was a renewal of Catholic life in England, and they were invited over to England to do missionary work in rural Leicestershire, and they had quite success, really. So I was brought up with a religious congregation, although in the end I didn't join them.
Okay. If we dial it back a wee bit, did you have many brothers and sisters? Or?
Yes, I only have two brothers. I have an older brother, and Brian, and a younger brother, Kevin, who both still live in Leicestershire, and they both worked as engineers. My elder brother's an electrical engineer. My younger brother worked for Rolls-Royce, and so I was the odd one out, really.
Right.
My father said I never wanted to get my hands dirty.
So, in that regard, at school, what sort of subjects did you like?
Oh yes. I really liked geography and history were the things I really liked, and even from primary school, I was really, attracted to the history of the country, and geography and the knowledge of the world and everything like that. And I remember once when I was in the primary school, I think I drew a kind of a map of the continent of Africa, not knowing that one day I would eventually work there myself. So these things must have been operating in the back of my mind, as a young child. Yeah.
And you spoke about you coming from a traditional kind of Catholic family. What did that look like? How did faith play a part in your life at a young age?
Well, I remember my uncle, which is my father's brother, also John McFadden. My father used to tell me about him. He actually tried his vocation with the Mill Hill Fathers, and as a young man, and went to the Mill Hill Fathers in Lochwinnoch, and then he went to them in Liverpool, in Freshfield in Liverpool, and got as far as being a subdeacon. And then the war broke out, and he got called up, and then one thing led to another, and in the end he met his wife, my Auntie May, who's from Port Glasgow. They got married, so he lost his vocation. But we always used to receive their missionary magazine at home, and so I suppose the idea of the mission of the church was always something there in our family, and but as we were regular churchgoers, especially my mother, extremely devoted to the local church, and I went to a Catholic school where again we had the Rosminian sisters teaching us, and then once when I was in the final year of primary school, the vocations director of the Holy Ghost Fathers, Father Byrne, he came and gave us a talk on the Holy Ghost Fathers, and of course said, if anybody wants to join us and be a missionary, then come and give me your name. So we all ran up, all the boys ran up and gave their names. I gave my name, but I seem to have been one of the few who actually kind of followed it through I didn't go immediately to the junior seminary. I waited till I was nearly 15, and I went into Form 3 in the junior seminary of the Holy Ghost Fathers, which was near Grange over Sands, Lancashire, in England. So I was there for 4 years, and we were taught virtually exclusively by Holy Ghost fathers in their junior seminary, which they'd had since about the turn of the century, since about 1908 or so. We bought that property in a very nice part of Lancashire, right on the edge of the Lake District, right on the edge of Morecambe Bay. We had lovely days when we used to go up the mountains, and days like today, we'd just walk up Helvellyn and we didn't think much about it, didn't realize the risks we were taking. But again, all the men who taught us virtually were guys who had been in Nigeria. Nigeria was the main mission field where the Holy Ghost fathers from England used to go, or I suppose from Britain we must say now, because several of them were Scots, of course. And so I heard all about the places, the villages, the towns, the tribes, the people, their customs, their way of life, since the time I went to the junior seminary. So when I eventually got there, I sort of felt very much at home. It wasn't. I didn't suffer in any way from any kind of cultural shock. But of course, in between that, I did my novitiate in Ireland. We didn't have sufficient novices in England to have a novitiate in this country, so we went to Ireland, 4 of us, and I was with Father Philip Marsh, who's still with us also. So we followed all the training together. After the novitiate, we went to the Missionary Institute in London, which was set up by 7 exclusively missionary societies in Britain at the time: the Mill Hill Fathers, the White Fathers, SVD, SMA, Consolata, Verona Fathers, and Holy Ghost Fathers. And it was it was a wonderful preparation for life in a country different to your own, because all the lectures, whatever subject they were teaching us, the influence of their life on the missions in many parts of the world came into everything that we learned. And when I eventually got to Nigeria, both Philip and I were posted to do our pastoral year. We'd finished all our studies. We did up to degree level. We got our degrees in theology from the Missionary Institute, which was affiliated to Louvain in Belgium. Then we were still students when we got sent off to Nigeria. We weren't ordained in any way, and we had 2 years there. A wonderful experience. 2 of us started off teaching in different schools, secondary schools, which I enjoyed tremendously. The kids were just great. They were just avid for learning. If I didn't give them any homework any time, they'd stop me going out the classroom, that kind of, and they'd say, "Father, you forgot to give us your," well, they called me Father, but they didn't know I was only a student at the time. "You forgot to give us our homework," and I'd have to mark about 40 books, because every class had 45 kids in them. One factor about Nigeria which makes it stand out above any country in Africa is the huge population.
Yeah.
I don't think many people realize that it has a huge population, the biggest population in Africa. That's why there's so many Nigerians around. The population is estimated to be coming up to 200 million now, I think about 160 million or something like that. It's just a massive population and continues to grow. And already the church is quite a significant player in the country. It's about 13 million Catholics, and so many of the major missionary religious orders had people there, male and female societies like the White Fathers, the SMA, and the Augustinians, the Dominicans, and the Holy Rosary Sisters, the Daughters of Charity, and Our Lady of the Apostles. All had significant numbers of missionaries there, and such that the actual potato that we can grow in the northern part of the country, the local people call it Irish potato, because the sisters were the ones who kind of popularized it as a food.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of if we go back a bit to your vocation, you obviously spoke about the missionary priest coming into the school. Did you feel something inside you from a young age that you had a call? I
did, yes. It's difficult to define it. It wasn't. I didn't get any clear sign or any indication, but I think each step along the way there were little indications that this was the path to follow. As I say, I had that interest in geography. I had that interest in other cultures and other peoples, and it was always pulling me along a little bit. And the more I heard about it, the more interested I became in it. even though when we were in the junior seminary in the 1960s, of course, there was the terrible civil war in Nigeria from 1967 to 1970, when frightening reports of terrible violence and, of course, the efforts at starving the Igbo population out was used as a weapon of war, which it was quite frightening when I was thinking to myself, my goodness, that's the country where I'll probably go to work,
Yeah.
which I did eventually. But Philip and I arrived there in 1977, and by then the war had finished. Already 7 years had gone by, and the country was pulling together again, and they were going through a petrol boom. There was a lot of money around, and we had no job, but not really any problems getting a job in the Catholic schools where we taught, and we got salaries which helped us to survive, in the parish where the income was a bit shaky,
Yeah.
because the numbers of Catholics weren't too high then. But while we were there was just a tremendous increase in the number of people coming to joining the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Couple more questions about your vocation. Were there any surprises that following your vocation brought, and what does the term vocation mean to you in a broader sense?
Any surprises? I think my mother and father were more surprised than anything that here the middle boy John was thinking of becoming a priest. And I remember I was an altar server as a boy, of course, in the local parish, and the parish priest thought that I might have had a vocation, so he invited us, my mother and myself, to Ratcliffe College, which is very nearby where we lived. It was established by the Rosminian Fathers in the early part of the century, but it was a fee-paying school, private school, and when my mother heard what the school fees were, she just said, "There's no way in which you can come here, John." So that was out. I've often told the Rosminians, because they have often asked me, why did they not join them? Mm-hmm. And that's the story I told them. It says we couldn't. When we heard the school fees, my mother just said no. But when the Holy Ghost Fathers, I don't know how they did it, but their fees were a lot less. But I mean, it wasn't such what you might call an exclusive private school as what the Rosminians had.
Yeah.
What was the other question again?
Just in terms of vocation, what does it mean to you in a broader sense?
Yes, obviously it is a call, and it's a call to a certain way of life as a priest. It's not with a vow of poverty and chastity and obedience as well, and a readiness to meet people of other cultures and other languages in totally different circumstances. Only afterwards did I realize that it was a special vocation. I remember one of our vocation directors here in Scotland. He used to go around and give talks to the universities here in Scotland and wherever he could give a talk. And he got a group of young men together, and when he sat down to interview them and talk to them about what their idea of priesthood was, not a single one of them wanted to be religious, and not a single one of them wanted to be a missionary. They all wanted to be priests in Scotland. And that's when I realized that, it's to be a missionary is quite a significant different vocation. It's a different calling. It's a different, the expectations you had, as I say, even from the time we went to the junior seminary, we knew what we were heading for, what kind of life it was, what the kind of people we might be dealing with, and the problems we would meet, and the sort of talents, the gifts, and the aptitudes we'd need to survive, including things like being a car mechanic, that you're experiencing today, to keep the parish car going in very difficult circumstances where you might not easily be able to get a mechanic or somebody like that,
Yeah, I think you've kind of answered this a wee bit, but why did you choose the Holy Ghost Fathers or Spiritans?
Yes, that was it. Really, it was circumstances more than anything, and it was the as I say, back in my mind, the Mill Hill Fathers magazine was always in the house, and then the Rosminian Fathers, they thought that I had a vocation, but when their vocation director came along and described his life on the missions in Africa, in my youthful enthusiasm, it sounded like something that I would like to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of, Is there a kind of saint or a scripture passage that's kind of inspired your vocation?
There's one I chose from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, which I put on my ordination card, and it's I can do all things in Him in whom I put my trust. Feeling and recognizing my own inadequacies and not knowing the answers to everything, not being capable in many areas of life, then giving it over to the Lord and praying that with His help and with His grace, we can face many problems and know how to deal with them. And so that's been an inspiration for me since the time of my ordination. Before that, in those days we never thought much about Scripture. We never thought too much about Scripture. But I remember the first time I began to read the Bible was in the junior seminary. Even though we had a Bible at home, I never used to. Well, I used to look at it. It was with pictures, those were the days when we had a missal,
Yeah.
But I did in the early days in the seminary read the life of Father Lieberman, who was our second founder, a convert from Judaism, and it did have a profound effect on me.
Okay.
I remember as a young boy in my early teens, reading the Star of Jacob, and it really had a profound effect on me, and I admired that man from that moment and up until this time. His commitment, his vision, his sense of sacrifice, and his gifts of spiritual direction, his gifts of insight, and his knowledge. He never went to Africa. He never set foot on the African continent, but he was able to direct a missionary congregation from Paris, through sending letters. He just had that natural gifts that very often Jewish people seem to have in some ways. Like people say that, Edith Stein had the same kind of aptitudes and gifts and insights into people's characters and knew how to deal with people, and same as Father Lieberman did. So that's a profound influence, and much of his writings I still go back to them now. And he would write to the people in Dakar in Senegal, mostly French, of course, in those days, and be blacks with the black people, and be as to them servants, and don't get too friendly with the colonial officials, for example, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I always thought there was a real natural wisdom in what the advice he used to give to his missionaries. Yes.
And to be a seminarian, to be a priest, to be a religious sister, to be a missionary priest, you need to at times draw strength from somewhere. Where do you draw strength from?
Oh, I definitely think it's from our prayer life. All through, since it was when I went to the novitiate. The novitiate again was a crucial experience for me personally in developing my spiritual life, and of course that's what it's for. And I do believe that whatever one has to do as a priest, whatever gifts you have and whatever positions and responsibilities you might be called to, underpinning all of it must be your spiritual life and your closeness to the Lord, your commitment to prayer. I enjoy praying the Psalms. I say the Rosary every day. I've always received strength from the Rosary and meditating on the mysteries of the Lord. I've even invented some mysteries myself, like the 5 appearances of Jesus after the resurrection sort of thing in Paschal time, and the 5 great sayings of Jesus: I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd. Just varying the reflection a little bit. So the Rosary has been a lot to me, and the commitment to as much spiritual reading as possible, and working with the poor and the handicapped and the people on the margins a little bit, which we used to meet a lot of course, in Africa, and I draw a lot of strength from. And my love of history too. I would read more history books, serious history books, and draw a lot of strength from what's happened in the past and see how things have worked out, of people who've made big decisions, leaders who've been, who've made bad decisions or good decisions, and where, history has been created. I draw a lot of strength from reading books on history. I've just finished reading a book on Mary, Queen of Scots now, which I found fascinating. The guys found a lot of new material that was used and against poor old Mary, by that guy Cecil, who really was intent on having a killed.
Yeah.
And I've just started a book on George III now, Farmer George. So I don't know what I'm going to learn from George III. But I get a lot of strength from reading history books, and I actually studied church history in the Gregorian University
Right.
for 2 years. After when Philip and I were ordained, we were ordained the same year. He was ordained in his hometown of Hartlepool. I was ordained in my home. I was ordained in Loughborough actually, because the Rosminians again, their parish. And immediately after our ordination, Father Holmes, who used to be the superior here, God rest him, he sent the two of us to the Gregorian University, and Philip studied missiology, and I studied church history. And again, it was right down my street, and I really enjoyed it, even though it was all in Italian.
So, your vocation, you said, took you to Nigeria.
Yeah.
When was that? How long were you there for?
In total, I was there for 10 years, which is not much because I'm living together with Father Gaffney now, who was there 30 years, and before him also Father O'Sullivan was there 30 years. I did 2 years as a student there, and then we came back and we studied at what happened then when I came back the first time. That was when we were students here. We came back and then we went to Rome, and then from Rome I went out to Nigeria. This is about 1980 or so, and I did two more years. But I got quite sick. I got TB actually. I had to come home, and then I spent a year in a new parish we had in Birmingham. But then again, when that was cleared up, I went back to Nigeria again, and I taught in the school, and then I went out to parish work, which of course it's a big population and it's 13th in size in superficial area in the country, but it's distances were still big between villages, but the villages were well inhabited, and we had a lot of work with the adult catechumenate. At that time we did start off in the early days, like our Irish confreres in the south of the Igbo land. They used the schools as a means of evangelizing and as well as educating, and we did the same up in the northern. We were in the middle belt of Nigeria. We worked with the Tiv and the Edoma and the Egede and some Hausa-speaking peoples before coming up to Jos. So our Irish confreres were further in the south with the Igbo, which is a very large tribe, which I would say probably counts about up to 10 million people now. We work with the Tiv. The Tiv would be about 4 million, a large tribe, but we worked there since the 1930s. Actually, it's quite recent. We penetrated through that part of Nigeria from Onitsha. The first French missionaries of the Holy Ghost congregation arrived in 1885 on the banks of the River Niger, and they set foot. They came down at a town called Onitsha. Onitsha was a big slave dealing center on the river, and they proceeded then to buy the slaves and redeem them, give them their freedom and the choice of being educated. And then the hope was to use the slaves, the converted slaves, to evangelize their own people. But not long into that kind of policy, they found out that the local people had very little respect for those who had been slaves. So we turned it around to try and start schools, because the British administration, by that time the British had more or less taken over sort of as a protectorate, the British administration were looking for local people who could speak and write English. So we started doing that, and people came to us in droves for education as well as the faith. A bit of both, really. And we tried it up in the north for the same reasons, but then the government suddenly took the schools away from us. So we had no means we couldn't just go into the primary schools or the secondary schools to teach the catechism. So providentially, at the same moment, the church had renewed the rite of Christian initiation of adults. So we adapted it to the local people, and it took off like a bomb. And we were getting, we weren't getting children, and we were getting more teenagers, young adults, and elderly people who coming to join the church. And most of the people were, uneducated. The elderly ones, of course, could never read a book. But they were taught by local catechists in the village. We sort of translated the local into the local languages, the old penny catechism that we had, really. And that was the basis of our teaching the faith, And we had the catechumenate over 3 years, and we'd anoint them at each time. We charged them 50p, every time, which is we got quite a bit of income from that. But well, with the oil boom in Nigeria, there was a lot of money around in Nigeria, and people had money, but they were also very hard-working farmers, and I really got to admire. I really did admire the hard work that the people did in growing their own food. The staple diet was the yam, and they adored the yam. They would have yam for morning, noon, and night. And one of our priests described this as a cross between plaster of Paris and potato. But I got to like it, because you can fry it, you can boil it, you can put it you can make it little potato cakes, and you can do so many things with it,
Yeah.
And I got to prefer it to potatoes, which were always, you could buy potatoes there, but they were all the same type and a bit difficult to get sometimes. You had to travel to markets far away to get them. But yes, the diocese was about the size of Ireland. It was Mercurdi diocese. The seat of the bishop was in Mercurdi, which is on the river Benue. Benue is another tributary of the Niger, a very large river, which cuts even in the national badge of Nigeria is kind of a Y shape, and that depicts the river Niger coming in from the west, joining the Benue in the center, and coming down into the Atlantic as one stream. So that was where we worked.
And what was how were you received in Nigeria, and what was your kind of overall first impression of life there?
The welcome we received from the local people was tremendous. Extremely open, welcoming, friendly, and very, it was exceptionally welcoming. In fact, I learnt a lot about the hospitality of the people. Most people who had very little, but they welcomed us with open arms, and they were extremely receptive to what we did and what we said, and we worked together a lot with them. The elders were always a bit suspicious, in the villages, but we used to go and stay overnight in the villages, and do a trip of, there was a lot in the past, they did a lot more of that, but the people always had a clean, it would be a mud hut with a grass roof, but it would be clean, swept and tidy, and you'd be able to put your bed in there and sleep there overnight. Of course, you'd have to have a mosquito net, which was a real essential for staying out in the bush in Africa, as you can imagine. And take some clean water. Water was always a big problem. I did get hepatitis once through drinking untreated water, and that wasn't very pleasant. I had to stop drinking alcohol for 6 months. Alcohol, oil, and peppery foods. But the language betrayed their feelings, because the language was so simple. Those things, welcome was very, very often said. Welcome, you are very welcome. And then after you would leave, you say, they say thank you for coming. And we'd come away from the villages with, again, a lot of yams, gifts, and usually a couple of chickens or ducks sometimes, I remember one place they gave me a duck for some reason, and when I took it back in, by the time I got back to the Central Mission with this duck, it had died, you see, and so the parish priest said to me, he said, "John, all you brought back is a dead duck." So he said, maybe we could make duck soup with it. I said, "Is it duck soup?" I said, "That doesn't sound very interesting." Oh, and he says, there was a film by the Marx Brothers called Duck Soup.
That's right.
Duck soup. No, the people were welcoming. Unfortunately, I think officialdom was a bit, the airports, they weren't very welcoming. I don't know why, but once we got to meet the ordinary people living in the bush, as we call it in the bush, sometimes they don't like being referred, but people living in the remoter areas were extremely welcome, extremely respectful, and very, very lovable, really, and always in good sort of humor and very positive and optimistic people with a good outlook on life, even though they had very little.
And you said earlier on about having almost like studied Nigeria kind of intensely. Yeah. So did nothing really come as a culture shock that much?
I could honestly say no, because we'd heard all about the people and their customs, their language, and their way of life. As I said, their diet, their food, and how they were. They were all nearly peasant farmers growing their own food and living in their villages. the houses they built themselves out of mud and grass, and I can't remember anything really striking me as being surprising, because even there's some of the darker sides of life. I didn't really meet much of it at all.
Yeah.
Like things like I know it goes on. Of course, there's witchcraft that goes on, and that kind of thing. We had some of our fathers who worked in Sierra Leone as well. Sierra Leone was one of the missions where the English province men used to go. And my predecessor here, the late Father Terry, Terry was in Sierra Leone.
That's right.
And I think we had some of the fathers who came from Sierra Leone and gave us talks in this junior seminary would very often refer to these secret societies, that they have in Sierra Leone. I forget the name of them now. But they were a bit frightening. But I never really came across anything like that in Nigeria, whether I was a bit naive or whether it was just going out of fashion. But, darker things were existing, and I didn't see a lot of it.
Do you have any, standout memories or stories from your time in Nigeria? Is there anything that stands out to you?
I can't remember. I remember. Well, the simple things, really. I remember after we'd finished in Benue, we moved out of Makurdi Diocese because the local clergy were becoming so numerous that we had to move out to make space for them.
Yeah.
So it was a question of what they call disengagement, finding the right moment to disengage, hand over to the local clergy. So we, Father O'Toole, who was the former superior out there, the former provincial here, he went up further north to the Yola Diocese, which to speak to Bishop Sheehan, who was an Augustinian, and they asked him does he need any priests, and the guy says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Of course I do. However many you've got, I'll take them," because he only had 9 local clergy ordained for his diocese, and all the rest were Augustinians, and so he welcomed us with open arms. So we all moved up, lock, stock, and barrel, up to the northeast of Nigeria, and we had to learn a new language in many ways. We had to speak Hausa, and so I was up there for how many years? 3 years in Yola, which is now a big refugee camp. It's on the Benue again, but very close to the Cameroon border. In fact, some of my stations were just 7 miles away from the border. I visited some of my outstations. I had to speak French all night long, So that was an area. The usual thing. I was planning my pastoral visits, and this catechist said to me it was around about March, and the rainy season was about to begin, and I had to cross quite a big river, but it was absolutely dry in the dry season, just sand, and I crossed it quite a few times in the dry season. And the catechist said to me, "Father," said, if you come across that river and stay overnight, you might not get back for 6 months, you see. You might not get back over the river."
Yeah.
So I thought, "God, blimey, that's true." But anyway, I took a chance, and I went to this place, and I said Mass. I think I stayed overnight and came back the next day. About midday, I came to the edge of the bank, and my goodness, it was filling up with water. It had rained somewhere. We didn't get any rain, but wherever the rain fell, It was coming down that river, and the river was filling up. I thought, "Oh God, I'm going to be stuck in exactly the situation where the catechist said." So I don't know. I got into the river, the bed of the river, and I just put my foot down in the car and straight across and up the bank. And God, was I thankful then? But I mean. That's I can't remember. There's no standout memories. I can't remember anything really that.
You said that you had a hand in education. Was there anything? Did you feel that you were making a tangible difference in people's lives through education?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. I think we did make it. Yeah, we the guys who came that I was dealing with were, as I said, very hungry for education. I used to teach Bible knowledge. Mm-hmm. They loved it, and I got to know a lot more of the Bible as well myself. But very often, then during the holiday time, I'd go out to the remote villages and meet the guys that I'd been teaching in the school, and they'd be very often be my interpreters.
Yeah.
They would interpret into the local language, which. I was dealing mainly with Tiv and Idoma and then Hausa up in the north, and it would be, because things were so fluid at that time, and you knew that you weren't going to stay very long in one place. I never invested so much time in trying to learn the languages so that I wouldn't be able to have a conversation, for example, or even preach. Hausa would have been a lot easier than the other languages, which were different languages altogether. But no, I think we made a big difference to people's lives. We stimulated, we stimulated growth. We stimulated the place where we stayed, where the religious superior had his headquarters in a place called Aliede. We built the school there at the crossroads of two roads. There was nothing there when we established the school.
Yeah.
But when we started building the school, the builders came, the contractors, the guys with the cement, and the guys with the wood, and the guys with the concrete blocks, and the guys selling the pipes for water and all that. And so a market grew up there, and then the market became regular, and then the people would. So very often we'd see, and we built a hospital there too. And late Father Jeffrey built another hospital, which served the community very well. And of course, we didn't make any distinctions between the people who used to come to the hospital. Everybody from any tribe who came along, and we actually got a lot of help from Frank Sinatra. Would you believe it? He became one of our benefactors.
Wow.
Yeah, the story is that Bishop Murray of McCurdy, an Irish Holy Ghost father in the British province, he sent one of our priests, Father Tom Rooney, from the northeast of England, to the United States to do fundraising for these projects. He wanted to build 3 hospitals in 3 strategic places in the diocese. And Father Tom Rooney, somehow came in contact with Frank Sinatra, who wanted to make his peace with the church because he was in a rather difficult marriage situation. I don't know the details at all, but Father Tom was able to sort out Frank Sinatra's marriage situation. And for that reason, Frank Sinatra was forever grateful to him and began to give us thousands and thousands of dollars to build our hospitals. Now, of course, this something that never hit the headlines, but and he also made huge contributions for us to build a new cathedral, a modern cathedral, because our German brothers, when they went to McCurdy in the 1930s, built the first cathedral in McCurdy out of brick, burnt brick, as they called it, using mud from the River Benue, which is still standing. It's a parish church now, but by the 1970s, 80s, we needed a new cathedral, and Frank Sinatra was a very big contributor to the cathedral. And there was a question of whether he was going to come out for the opening of it, but in the end, I thought it was too much of a security risk, so he didn't come. But yeah, so there we are. That's something that you wouldn't know about a man who was in the floodlights all his life, but he helped us a lot in the diocese. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
In terms of, you spoke a bit earlier on about talents needed and stuff like that. What do you think are the most important qualities or characteristics that a missionary has to have?
I think you need patience, you need tolerance, you need understanding, and an appreciation of people's cultures, an appreciation of the way people see things differently, the appreciation that they're coming from a culture that's entire. I mean, we're talking about first-generation Christians. Where we're talking about people who've only heard the gospel, for about the last 30 or 40 years, for example.
Yeah.
So you couldn't expect people to be what's what I'm looking for? Paragons, that's it. Paragons of virtue. Immediately living wonderful. Many of them do, of course, but. Paragons of virtue, of Christian life immediately. But so you need to have a wide acceptance of people's faults and see the goodness which is always there. I found there's genuine goodness and appreciation and in the people I met when I was working out there at all levels. As I say, apart from the officialdom at the airport was always a bit difficult, but even sometimes the passport controls were very easy. Not too difficult. I had more problems in Italy in some ways. But yes, you need to have a great understanding of people's cultures and way of life, and get to love it really in the end, and appreciate it, which I think I did. And I was actually called to come home then.
So, Father John, what would you say are the most important qualities or characteristics that a missionary must possess?
Well, I think you've got to be ready to move out of your, as they say nowadays, your comfort zones, and that means going to a different culture, different surroundings, different peoples and ready to adapt and to learn a different language, to eat strange food, and to be able to survive and to be comfortable in that situation. And it's quite a special vocation. I think that we do speak about people having a missionary vocation, and um, we experienced this call to go overseas, which was the classical idea of the missionary, I suppose. It was very much in geographical terms because we went to countries that were former colonies. I went to Nigeria, and many of some of the other members of this province went to Sierra Leone, like my predecessor, Father Donnelly. But yes, it's definitely a desire to be challenged by a different culture and to be able to bring the good news of the gospel into that culture and into the people that you meet, who of course are living a very different way of life to what we're used to. So it's not it's quite in contrast to someone who has a vocation to the diocesan priesthood, whereas normally the classical idea of a diocesan priest will be somebody who remains in his own country, remains in his own the diocese that he grew up in, and is used to that culture and is used to the language, and is not going to be traveling out too much from the place where he was born and brought up. But you definitely have to have an openness and a readiness to go to a strange place and to learn strange languages, and it's a very big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say anybody who's not good at languages, for example, shouldn't have a missionary vocation, because I wouldn't put it as a condition. But at one time it was a condition in our congregation that you had to be ready to be sent overseas, outside of your own home country, wherever you were asked to go. And of course in former days the vow of obedience was very much taken for granted, that if you were appointed to this country, then you didn't ask any questions. Nowadays there's a big long process. I saw this going on all the time when I was working in the Generalate in Rome, in our general administration. The young men coming up for ordination then have to write a letter to the General Council requesting a posting to a different country, and they would give three preferences and the reasons why they were choosing this country or that country, and then our general administration would look at the requests coming from the young ordinands, if you like, the guys coming up for ordination, and then try to match them with. We'd send in the missions overseas would also send in their needs, how if they needed anybody and what work would they need them for. So they were always trying to match the requests with the guys who were becoming available. And over the years I worked in Rome, we had an average of about 50 to 60 every year to be appointed to missions outside of their most were appointed outside of their countries. Some, of course, who showed a degree of intelligence or commitment to academics, we send them for further studies, of course. But it's part of our training now. It's given that a young man who is in our formation structures should spend 2 years on placement outside of his own culture, usually outside of his own country, to make sure that he is someone who can adapt to a different culture, a different environment, and a different way of life.
Okay. And obviously, from your own experience, what are the positives and the negatives, maybe, about being a missionary?
The positives, I think, are really witnessing and seeing and being part of people living in a way that's completely in contrast to what you might be used to in Western Europe, and people living in ordinary mud huts and with grass roofs that they've built themselves with bamboo structures, and seeing how the people, when my experience was Africa, and of course it's the same for many who are in Africa, just seeing how the people manage to survive and are very, very happy and are able to lead lives, very simple lives, and but they have everything they need. The people are hardworking. My experience was the TIF people that I worked with, for example, they work very hard. They grow a lot of food, grow all their own food. All the wildlife, mind you, has disappeared. I saw an account of an English guy who went hunting in the 1920s in the central part of Nigeria where I worked, and he was trying to collect, these heads that you see on these old stately homes of antelope and deer and goodness knows, and there were herds and herds of wildlife, antelope and deer and zebra and hippos in the river, crocodiles, everything under the sun. And by the time I got there, we wouldn't see any wildlife. So, people had eaten everything because the pressure of population was so much that any wildlife that was there was actually gone. So, basically, people are vegetarians. The yam was their staple diet, morning, noon, and night. And but they knew how to grow it. They grew it well. They grew a lot of extra that they could sell, for which they would get a little income, then little financial security. But yes, just experiencing the way the people survived in Africa was quite phenomenal and quite impressive, and to see the way in which the people knew how to put everything together and lead very happy and be very content with what the little that they have, and also the generosity. I mean, we're coming from such a society, and yet we would go to stations far away from the center of the parish to say mass, and people would very often, mostly always, give us a chicken at the end of mass, or and 20 or 30 yams, oranges, bananas, pawpaws, the lot. And we'd take them back. That would be our food. I mean, very often we'd eat it through the week, and we used to have fruit salad every day for lunch, because we had so many bananas, oranges, and pawpaws, and beautiful. We didn't have too many vegetables like cabbages or carrots or turnips, things like that. But we made up for lack of vitamin C in our diet by the fruits that grow there, which they just grow in abundance in many parts of the country, and being able to communicate in a really strange language too is quite a blessing, and quite you feel quite chuffed that you can. Well, I've actually said something that people understand, and having committed oneself to try and learning the language, although things were moving so fast in the church when I was there, in the sense that we knew we were handing over to the local people and the local clergy who were coming up. They were being trained very quickly. The local diocesan vocations were coming in, so we knew that our time there was quite short. So we didn't have a lot of time to be able to know the language extremely well to the level of conversational level. But even so, one of the great blessings was be able to use these languages and speak and be understood in them, which I found very nice. The other side of things was it's a lot of health challenges. You're open to a lot of. We've been brought up in such a refined Western society where most sicknesses and illnesses have disappeared, from daily life, and yet when you go into an African situation, you're quite exposed to a lot of viruses and diseases that we wouldn't have been used to in childhood, which other generations would have, like TB, for example, and typhoid and hepatitis. These are all quite ordinary things that we'd get, in malaria quite frequently, because mosquitoes are everywhere.
Yeah.
So I got very seriously sick in the 1980s. I picked up TB, and I was 8 weeks in hospital out there. I lost 2 stone in weight. I never moved from my bed, and yet I lost 2 stone. I didn't realize I was losing so much weight. And actually, the doctors and the sisters this is where I've always got a soft spot in my heart for the Daughters of Charity, because they ran the hospital where I stayed, and they were really wonderful looking after me. Some of them were Irish, some of them were Nigerian, a mixed community, but they were the hospital they ran was a wonderful institute. We had built it, and the Diocese of McCurdy, and I spent 8 weeks there. And while I was there, one of Father Joe D'Ambrosio, who was from Scotland, he came in with hepatitis. He was yellow, when he came in, and he stayed for a few weeks and he went away. And another father came in with, he had what did he have? Typhoid or something. And I stayed there. I was there for 8 weeks before I was well enough to come home. And so yes, it can be that would be the downside, of going to work in the countries, you're kind of open to a lot of illness and sickness, which is endemic. Which you see the people suffering from them all the time. And obviously, when we first went out there, we had to have inoculations against cholera and yellow fever and hepatitis, and there was another one, I forget what it was. But then the Nigerian government sort of waived all that, and we could go in without any proof of inoculations, because I think they felt it was giving their country a bad sort of impression. That they had all these diseases that were endemic. So that would be the downside, negative part of things. Yes.
Okay. The term mission itself, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, it means to go out and to be sent. Of course, literally from the Latin, missio, mittere, missi, whatever the principal parts are. Yeah, it means you don't give yourself. We interpret it in our congregation as being given a mission, being sent somewhere by somebody, and that you don't choose it yourself, but you're actually requested to go to such and such a place and be someone who bears the love of Christ and the news of the gospel to people, either who maybe haven't heard it for the first time, or who maybe are working with people who are first generation Christians. And one of the things I always used to remind myself is that we can't expect the people that we worked with in Africa to be living fully according to Christian values, because they've only been Christians for less than a generation. We're up against a culture, traditional religious African culture that's been there for thousands of years. So there are a lot of attitudes and a lot of practices and things that will take generations to disappear, as they did in Europe. So we couldn't expect people to be paragons of virtue, and within a very short number of years. So I think we had to be very tolerant and understanding and and patience. Patience was, I think, a very important thing as well in the missionary life, because I remember our fathers used to say that certain tribes were very slow to respond. They were very slow to accept us, very slow to accept baptism and listen, and yet they just plodded on. I mean, they'd go to some stations out in the villages, and they might get 3 or 4 people for confession and communion, for example, and then all of a sudden the thing just took off like a rocket, and we were dealing with hundreds and hundreds of people. It just seemed to happen. I suppose that's an indication of the Holy Spirit blowing where He wills. Suddenly, from there being very little response, a very slow response, and lack of interest, all of a sudden our churches were full. We had hundreds of people for baptisms, and we were hearing confessions for hours, and it was just became too much for us in many ways. And that's just when we handed over to the local clergy, when they really got the benefit of, we were collecting pennies, from the people in the stations, outstage, just collecting pennies, and our diocesan clergy now are really rolling in they're getting sums of money which we couldn't even dream of when we first went out there. So it's those who are sowing in tears will sing when they reap. The words of the psalm that we say sometimes about missionary works, it's come very true. Many of our guys slugged their hearts out walking through the African bush and going from station to station with very little reward, and mostly surviving on mass intentions. The financial support was basically from mass intentions that we got from home, and support from our families, friends, and parishes, and any projects, of course, that we had, we'd make special requests to agencies and so on, like the Little Way Association, which were excellent in helping us. But to be able to create a self-sufficient church was our aim and our goal, and I think we've certainly in Nigeria, I think we did that. We have achieved that under the grace of God. I can't say it was all our own work, but God's grace was there, and also the people eventually responded with great generosity.
Excellent. You'll obviously having been in Nigeria and stuff like that, and so the importance of the role that lay people play. How do you feel lay people can be missionaries, and what's the best way that they can live out their mission?
Are you talking about over there, overseas, or anywhere? Yeah.
There, here,
Yeah.
wherever.
Yeah. Well, in Nigeria, there's this very strong laity council, very strong, and it's very plays a prominent part in the life of the church in the country, and it's very well organized in the sense of, in an African way, if you like. But even at the parish level, there are very committed people and well-educated people who form the laity council in their parishes, and they play an important role in helping us to understand what's going on in the parish, advising us on all kinds of fundraising events, advising us on perhaps sometimes what villages to go to where we've been neglecting them. I mean, one of the groups of people that are so important in the life of the church in Nigeria that I saw were the parish catechists. The catechists played a crucial role, and they were very close collaborators with the priest. But they would be people, of course, local people who would speak the language, and very often they would be the ones who would sort out marriage problems and create the atmosphere whereby a couple who might have been thinking of entering into a Christian marriage, they would go and meet the couple and speak to them and then interview them and do all the hard work, if you like, and then present the couple to us for marriage in the church, a blessing of their marriage, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And organizing in the villages, we had volunteer catechists who would teach the young people and sometimes elderly people, and teach them the catechism. I mean, okay, it was learning it like we all did in the old days, learning things by rote, but it was actually translated. It was in their own language, which they could memorize. Very often once we had the adult catechumenate going, then a lot of people who were coming to us to be baptized were not able to read or write. And they just memorized everything. So the teaching of the catechism in the villages was done by lay volunteers. So they were of tremendous value to us, and teaching the children the catechumens, teaching them the catechism, and then we would come along. The priest or the main catechist would give them a test every through the stages of their catechumenate, and then present them on the Easter Vigil ceremony every year for baptism. And the Easter Vigil ceremony every year became a real whopper. It was a 5-hour long, and I presided at least 2 or 3 Easter Vigil ceremonies, which took 5 hours through the night. But it was wonderful. I mean, everybody played their part. The liturgies, the altar boys, and we had one occasion. I remember we had a 44-gallon drum of water. We had an oil drum that was filled with water for the baptism. And at the point when it came to me to do the baptism, one of the altar boys gave me a 1-pint mug, a beer mug, with a handle on it. So I poured a whole pint over everybody. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And people were soaking wet, but no, I said, this is, you're being born again. This is new life. Your new life in Christ. You're dying to sin and living to the new life of Easter, the new life of grace. And you have died to your old way of life, and now you're a new creation. And it was wonderful.
Yeah. And so there was really good involvement in Africa. What about here? How do you think the best way that lay people can live out their mission here?
Yes,
it might be quite different.
Yeah, I think the stage is coming where we need to have people who are confident in getting up onto the sanctuary to be able to lead services, because our priests are becoming so rare now, and there's tremendous pressure on us priests to gather people together every Sunday for reading. Well, again, the contrast. When we were in Nigeria, we would have huge parishes, huge numbers of people, maybe 2 or 3 priests, but we might have 60, 70 village churches, which we could never reach every Sunday. We'd only be able to go there maybe 2 or 3 times a year for actual Mass and confession. So most Sundays, the Sunday service was being led by a competent layperson who knew how to read, who had a smattering of Christian doctrine. Now, the only thing is we never knew what they were preaching about when we weren't there. I mean, I had a catechist in one station who was he was married in the church himself, and he was also he never touched alcohol. You see, he was teetotal, and these were the two subjects that he kept speaking about every Sunday. According to when he used to go to we had a police college nearby where I was, and he used to go. He was the catechist to the police college, and I got some feedback from them saying, "Father, he's always talking about us to tell us to get married in church and to stop drinking alcohol every Sunday." So that was the weak part of the if you like the lay involvement in the. But without those village leaders, we had the books printed, we had the readings printed, the Sunday service was printed. They sang their own hymns, and they'd collect, they make a little collection. Again, we never knew whether the full collection was brought into the parish centre or not. We had all sorts of systems to try and get them to record in a little book how much was collected on each Sunday and that kind of thing. But it all worked out very well, and it was always a lot of give and take. But I think there was a very big lay participation in the whole way. And here at home now, I think we've reached a stage now where we're going to need people like that who are quite confident to come before their people that they know, in their parishes, and hold a Sunday service without a priest, because there doesn't seem to be many in the pipeline, and all of us are getting older, and we won't be able to continue forever. So I think that's going to be a big challenge for the church in the future, and some of the deacons we've got, I know some of the deacons will probably be running parishes, and that. Again, every parish would need a committee of people to run the finances and look after the church and all that kind of thing. And that's where lay people are going to, I think, play a far bigger role in the future in the church.
You touched on it a wee bit there when we were talking about lay people in Africa and also here and things like that. How would you see the differences between the church in Africa and the church here in Scotland?
Yeah. Differences, right, okay. First of all, big numbers, as I say. Celebration of the liturgy is always a joyful occasion. Participation in the liturgy, is very strong. Singing always during the week, no question of just having a quiet mass. Everybody, sort of people are saying their own prayers in each corner, but singing every day all through the week, and then the Sunday mass can be really joyful and really, really uplifting. Really uplifting. Some of the singing is joyful. So sometimes here in Scotland it might be difficult to try and get people, raise them up a little bit to be a little bit sort of as if they're really celebrating life, in the liturgy, in the mass, if you like, as if it is a real celebration of a joyful celebration of the life and the death and resurrection of the Lord, and I don't know. I've always wondered about where this idea of the quiet mass comes from, And yeah, we would very rarely have anything like a quiet mass in Nigeria, in my experience. What was
just the kind of the main differences between the church in Africa and the church here?
Right, yeah. Well, I wouldn't say the church is poor now in Nigeria. No, Nigeria is a wealthy country, and but the people are learning how to support the church and to support their clergy. They were a bit sort of slow in the beginning because there's always this danger of missionaries creating a dependency culture whereby, the people there in the church are depending on, say, Western Europe or the United States or depending on us for support, which they were in the past, but now the situation is almost, going into reverse whereby the church there in Africa, the church in Nigeria, in my experience, is a church that's vibrant, and it's got enough resources to continue itself and to go into the future, to build its own churches, schools, and hospitals and so on. And I think they're taking up that responsibility in a big way, and realizing, the missionary. I remember going back to Nigeria after I'd left it. Really, I went back for an ordination of a bishop, and they were talking about the missionaries as if we were a century beforehand. As if we were in the far distant past. The missionaries. Why are they talking about us? Whereas it was only maybe 10 years previously that the last sort of European had left virtually the diocese, and yet to them it was something in the past. The missionaries, but they've taken on the responsibility. They've taken on what they realise they have to do, and it's wonderful to see. So
yeah,
we worked ourselves out of a job. That's
the aim, though, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And for a mission, that's when the missionary is successful. Strangely enough, it seems a contradiction. A missionary is successful when he or she works himself or herself out of a job and has passed on essentially the message of the gospel, the knowledge and the love of Christ, but also the way of how to live that commitment and how to realize it in the structures that we need for schools, education, hospital, all the services that we render in health, and also in the building of our churches and projects. Any project where the church can be of benefit. I mean, we had an agricultural project in Kirkcaldy Diocese which went very well. We had one of our Irish priests, Father Paddy Foley, and he was there for about 50. He was in Nigeria more than 50 years, and he was he worked out how to make tires. Would you believe it? Tires for tractors that weren't rubber, but they were made out of aluminium, because he couldn't get the tires for the tractors. And I've got photographs of them in some of my albums there. Every tractor had metal tires with ribs on them to grip the soil, because he says the tires were a phenomenal price, the proper rubber tires. So he created his own tires, and it worked very well. And he used to give tremendous help to people in their farms, even though some of the ways in which they grew, he racked his brains for years to try and see if yam farming could be mechanized, but it never worked out a way in which yams could be mechanized, because each yam has its own mound shaped like a kind of a pyramid, like a circular pyramid, and there's no way in which a machine could replicate those pyramids. For some reason the one yam would grow down into the pyramid, if you like, into the small, not just like a small mountain, and there was no way in which any machine, I don't think, if anybody could invent one, they would be doing very well, but they prefer to dig them themselves by hand, with a hoe, with a West African hoe.
What about the current situation for the Spiritans worldwide today? What's it looking like?
Well, again, we just a few months ago we received the names and the list of the newly ordained priests of our congregation worldwide, whose applications went in to the Generalate for their first. And again, I think there were over 60. So we're maintaining a sort of maintaining the number of newly ordained priests, although I think our numbers worldwide have gone down to about 2,005 or 2,800. But due to there's a great deal of mortality in the European provinces, of course, and it was sad. Being in Rome, we used to get the news of all the confreres who had died, and so many of them I'd known in Ireland and in France and in Holland, for example. We had the very big provinces in Holland, in Belgium, France, and Ireland. These were the big provinces in our congregation. Each of those would have had nearly 1,000 members, at one time, and they're all, and used to get quite a brief summary of the guys' lives and their commitments, and everyone was just incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
The kind of work they were doing, the countries they worked in, the number of years they worked there, and then their involvement in education and human development and so on was just phenomenal. And just ordinary guys, with no particular gifts, no particular qualifications from universities and that, but they just worked their heads off all their lives, and really just have to, I would be humbled very often to see the achievements of so many of our European guys, and we hope we've passed on that desire and that commitment to our younger members. In mostly, yes, we've mostly worked in Africa. Many, because we've had big Portuguese provinces as well that worked in the Portuguese-speaking countries, the French-speaking countries, and the English-speaking countries. So, we've the situation in Europe is very sad, where the provinces are dying. But as in this British province, we've managed to attract quite a few of our younger African priests to work here, to work in the church in Britain, in England, Scotland. I don't think we have a problem anybody in Wales at the moment, but I think there are more African priests now in our province than there are native priests, British priests. So we're trying to revive things a bit in Europe. We've taken on different projects, especially working with immigrants. We have a project in Manchester, working with asylum seekers and trying to help them, to support them, and give them all kinds of advice. That was actually founded by one of our lay. So we have a group of lay associates in the Manchester area, and they had the idea of this work with immigrants and asylum seekers, and it's called Revive. And Anne-Marie Fell and her husband were the first people working in it, and it's been continuing since. I was the provincial at the time when we celebrated 300 years, I think it was, of our congregation being founded, and each province was asked to sort of start up a missionary project within its own boundaries to mark the occasion, rather than having big celebrations and saying how good we are and what work we've done. We're just to try something new, take a new initiative. So that was the new initiative that we started in the 1980s, and it's still flourishing, and there's still they still work with there's a couple of fathers who work in it in Manchester. We have a parish not far from the Manchester City football ground where Revive has its centre, and we give advice, we give legal advice, and we give support to people who are seeking to get their to get legal recognition of their presence in the country. And many of them, of course, come from countries where we've worked. Sure. So sometimes our guys can speak their language. Some of them come from French-speaking countries like Congo, Brazzaville, where some years ago there was a terrible civil war, and one guy arrived from Congo. Now I'm just giving you the bare bones of his story, and he arrived in Manchester Airport, and he was befriended by Anne-Marie, and he was desperate to try and get in touch with his wife and children, because he was involved in politics in Congo. And one day he was in the opposition party, whatever that was, and he was given to believe that he better move quick, because tonight, somebody was coming to get him and his family, and they were given strong advice to run away. So they did, but in whatever happened in the confusion, he ran one way and his wife and children went in another direction, and he eventually got leave, or got however he arrived in Manchester, I don't know, but he must have asked for asylum in Britain, and then he got asylum, and he got information that his wife and children, then this is over a number of months, I suppose, his wife and children were in a refugee camp in Malawi. So Anne-Marie phoned me. She said, "John, do we have any missionaries in Malawi?" I says, "Yes, we do." She said to me, "Would they ever go to any of the refugee camps and see if they can find Mrs. whatever her name was?" You see, so I gave her the phone number of one of our guys there, who was a Nigerian priest, Father Emmanuel, and she asked Father Emmanuel if he would visit some of the refugee camps to see if she could find if he could find Mrs. So and so and the children. And lo and behold, he did. He found them. He found the wife and children in a refugee camp in Malawi, and so the next step was how to get to reunite, because the husband had got refugee status in England, then he had the right for his wife and children to join him. So she said she did some fundraising in the local parishes in Manchester, telling the story, and we just didn't need to pay the airfare for the wife and children to come. And eventually they got enough money. They paid their airfare. They arrived in London airport one day. I was down in London when they passed through to go and meet them, and they eventually had a big reunion in London airport. The family that had been divided, and then they moved up to live in Lancashire. They got homes in Lancashire somewhere, and the girls, I think there were two girls, could only speak French at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But then Anne-Marie told me that about after 3 years or so, they're all speaking English with broad Lancashire accents. So that's the kind of thing that, well, as I say, Anne-Marie is a layperson. That's the kind of thing. She was a very committed layperson, and I think she won the Catholic Woman of the Year award one year. I forget. Yeah, I don't know whether it was just in England or whether it covered the.
That's I mean, as far as stories go, it's got everything in it. It's got the involvement of a layperson.
Right.
It's got the connections that you guys have. It talks, the universality of the church, and helping people who are really struggling and connecting them as well. So that's a really lovely story.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got some experience of interaction with us and stuff like that in Missio Scotland. So, why do you think it's important for people to support Missio Scotland and its partners in the Pontifical Mission Societies?
Mm-hmm. It's all this question of looking outwards and beyond ourselves. We can't become too inward looking and think only about we're members of a worldwide church, and Missio Scotland helps us to see beyond Scotland or to see beyond Britain and play a role in the worldwide effort of bringing the gospel to the peoples of the world. And I think that's a really important thing, not to become too self-obsessed and too inward looking. And I saw often and sometimes in the homilies for the mission appeals, I remember seeing an advertisement in the newspaper once for business, and it said export or die. I said, yeah, that's exactly what being a missionary means, export or die. If a company doesn't export its goods and and reach out to people, the markets over there, it's not going to survive, it's not going to thrive. And it's the same with the church, and once we go beyond ourselves to reach out to the other parts of the world, I think it's tremendously enriching. And there's this tremendous cross-fertilization that takes place between one culture and another. Different views of the church, different ways of celebrating the liturgy, different interpretations of the gospel, of the daily readings. And from what I hear, our young African priests who are working in parishes around in Britain. But many people are saying, there's a refreshing newness about the way in which the African priests preach. It may be different. People might not very often understand completely what they're saying because of the accent's quite strong sometimes. But it's helping us to see beyond ourselves and not to get too caught up in our own little world. And it's a question of having a worldwide vision. And I mean that's something that Scotland is well known for, because I've become aware that there was some incredible Scotsmen who went to Nigeria. I mean, the greatest Scottish explorer, of course, known as David Livingstone. But Mungo Park, you've heard of Mungo Park, haven't you? Mungo Park was a Scottish Presbyterian. But he ended up in Nigeria. He died in Nigeria. He's buried in Nigeria, and he was trying to navigate the River Niger, because he was sent by the Royal Geographical Society to find. Africa was, well, it was they called it the Dark Continent, but it's also carte blanche. Nobody in Europe, in the 1800s knew what was inside the continent. So these intrepid explorers like Mungo Park were among the people who left Scotland, and he travelled. He was in Guinea. He started off in West Africa and followed the River Niger all the way through to Timbuktu, and he was one of the first people to reach Timbuktu. The geographers wanted to know where that river ended. They thought it went across to join the Nile. But Mungo Park and others realized that it makes a big turn. If you look at the map of the Niger River, it makes a huge turn at Timbuktu and goes directly south and joins the Atlantic. So he was navigating the Niger, and he came across some rapids, and it's not known whether he actually died or was drowned in the rapids, or whether some unfriendly natives actually killed him.
Right.
So, but I think his body was recovered. No, his body wasn't recovered. No, they never recovered his body. But there was a monument. There was a monument set up to him, and it's actually covered by a big hydroelectric dam called the Kanji Dam. Now they took the monument and put it on the side of the dam. I've never been there. But another great Scottish explorer in Nigeria was a guy called William Balfour Beatty. Beatty from Kirkwall, which is in the
Orkneys.
Orkneys.
Yeah.
He was a doctor, very studious, and he was also a member of the Royal Geographical Society. And he went out on the third Niger expedition, I think 1853 or so. And he had a hunt. You see, malaria was a killer. All white men in the interior of tropical Africa, within weeks, were dead from malaria. So nobody knew what caused it. Nobody knew why. But Beatty had a hunch that he'd read books written by the Jesuits about the Indians in South America who chewed on the bark of a tree to stave off fever. And the active ingredient in this bark was quinine. So he thought, if I give the guys on the boats, because this is when they found out that the Niger went down to the Atlantic. So he came in through the creeks of the Niger to go up to prove that it was the same river. So, but all the two Niger expeditions before him, all the white guys died to a man. But he gave the guys quinine every day, and they all survived. That was it. That was the breakthrough. The Portuguese knew about this, but they didn't tell the British. This quinine was a prophylactic against malaria, and so he made a real breakthrough from that time. Every white person who went to work for any reason in tropical Africa took quinine every day, and that was it. I mean, you weren't completely free of it, of course, if you forgot to take it. But I think he's one of the unsung Scottish heroes of African exploration, and he actually stopped and lived in the interior of Nigeria, where the river Niger meets the river Benue, which is the one I was used to, the Benue, in a big kind of a Y shape. The town on the confluence is called Lokoja, and he lived there for 5 years, and he married a native lady, or he may have had different girlfriends. The word for a white man, therefore, in that part of Nigeria became Beke, because it's the first white man they all saw.
Yeah.
And it was a corruption of Beke. And he had several children, and you can still see the genes in some of the people there, because some of them have green eyes or blue eyes. You've never seen a black guy with blue eyes. And so I thought, oh, cracky, he must be one of Beke's descendants. But then his bosses in London, the Royal Geographical Society, says, about time you came home. So he had to get on the boat to go back to London to write up his findings. And he stopped off in Freetown in Sierra Leone, and he died of dysentery in Sierra Leone.
Oh, jeez. After all that.
Yeah, and there were the Clapperton brothers. There were Dixon Denham was another Scottish explorer, and then we have the lady down in Calabar, Mary Slessor. Mary, when I think, what's this tremendous connection between Nigeria and Scotland? And I'm trying to work out a kind of if you like, an appeal sermon for Scotland, emphasizing this link, that there's tremendous cultural, historical, and traditional geographical links between Scotland and Nigeria, and therefore you should support us. No, but I mean these are tremendous,
Yeah,
all Scottish.
absolutely.
It's not, there's more than just David Livingstone, for example, who was interested, who did tremendous exploration work in Africa. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of folk that wouldn't have known that. They would have those facts about Nigeria and Scotland's links. Father John, we'll end it just on a nice wee light-hearted note, like we always do, by asking you to tell us something about yourself that maybe our listeners wouldn't know.
Oh, I don't know. What could the listeners wouldn't know? Tell them about myself.
Unless you're a completely open book,
No, what could I say now? No.
Have you got any hidden talents or skills that we don't know about?
I don't know. I do really like the challenge of. Well, now that I'm getting a bit to see, 4 years and what's it, 2 years and 10 now. I won't be able to learn many, but I did really like learning the African languages. I really enjoyed that, and I was sent as a young priest by Father Holmes, who died here a couple of, whose death I witnessed sadly a few years ago, and he is the one who sent me to do a course in linguistics with a Protestant group called the Wycliffe Bible Translators. You can imagine they were quite stridently anti-Catholic, but they were open enough to allow Catholics. There was a summer course down in High Wycombe in the south of England, the Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL, and it was 11 weeks, and there was about 4 or 5 SMA deacons on the course, the same as me. But we had a great time. It was excellent. Just what we needed as missionaries, a facility to be able to learn languages fairly quickly and to see how, the structure of a language, and how every language has to have nouns, verbs, and adverbs and adjectives. So the basic ingredient in every language is the same, but it's just the way they put them together.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful course, and I always very grateful to Father Holmes for him sending me on that. It gave me a great facility for learning the languages, and I had to work in 3 different languages. As I showed you the book that I think I showed you in the archives, I had the mass in 3 different languages, neither of them related in any way to each other linguistically, and different structures altogether, and I really enjoyed that. I think it was, and it's a tremendous. I thank God for that gift of being able to learn languages. And Father Holmes again, he's the one who sent me to Rome for further studies, and I ended up doing 13 years altogether in Rome, in different situations. I was 2 years there as a student with Father Philip Marsh, and then I came back to be the General Secretary for 7 years, and which was a tremendous time as well. I used to meet so many different confreres from all over the world. They'd come in. We used to have a session every year for the new superiors, how they were to conduct their responsibilities, and to get to know so many guys and speak so many different languages, and see the kaleidoscope of cultures and peoples that our congregation works with around the world. And it was a tremendous gift to be there at the center of our operations as a missionary society, and meeting all the guys, and also the center of the church, to see the Vatican and St. Peter's, and get into some nooks and crannies that one way or another that many people don't get to see, like the excavations under St. Peter's, and where St. Peter is supposed to have been buried, which is 30 feet below the main altar of St. Peter's, which is open to the public now, but they can only take 12 people in at a time, because there's a whole burial ground, complete cemetery under the floor of St. Peter's Basilica. Yeah. And it was all filled in by Julius II. Pope Julius II decided to rebuild a new basilica, because the one built by Constantine lasted 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before it started to fall down. And so Julius II, they called him the Papa Terribile, the terrible Pope. He had a terrible anger, and he said, knock the whole lot down, because they were repairing it piecemeal, doing this wall was falling down, so they straightened it, and this one was falling. But he decided flatten the lot. So they flattened the whole lot and built the new basilica, which is the one we see today, and that's already lasted 500 years. And it was tremendous to learn all that history and all that effort, and to know, sadly as well, that it was partly a contributory cause to the Protestant Reformation, because this guy in Germany was Tetzel, I think, Dominican friar, was preaching the indulgences, and he was getting all this money for indulgences and sending them to St. Peter's for the building of the new basilica. And that's when Martin Luther decided to rebel against this untheological use of indulgences to make money. So much of it went for the building of St. Peter's. But the other thing is a Scottish link again. Bonnie Prince Charlie and his father and brother are buried there in the crypt of St. Peter's, all in the same tomb. Bonnie Prince Charlie was born and died in Rome. That's another interesting history, because his brother, Cardinal Duke of York, was the Bishop of Frascati for about 35 years.
Jeez.
He then became a cardinal. Very close friend of the popes at the time, yeah, and played an important role. He kind of, Bonnie Prince Charlie was a bit annoyed at his brother when he decided to become a priest. And of course he never had any family. Neither did Bonnie Prince Charlie, so that was more or less the end of the Stuart line. But all three of them, the old pretender, the young pretender, and the Cardinal Duke of York, the Stuart family, are buried in the crypt, and there's a monument to them in the ground level basilica on the left hand side as you go in. There's a monument to the Stuart family. So there's always strong Scottish connections there.
Fantastic. Yeah. Father John, thank you very much for your time, and all the best. God bless.
Thanks very much, Jerry. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Missio Scotland is a Scottish branch of the Pontifical Mission Societies, the Pope's official charity for overseas mission. To learn more about the work of Missio Scotland, you can visit our website www.missioscotland.com. You can like us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Missio Scotland. You can also follow us on Twitter, Missio_Scotland, and on Instagram, Missio Scotland. If you would like to donate to Missio Scotland, visit www.missioscotland.com/donate. You can also call us on 01236 449 774 or send donations to Missio Scotland, 4 Laird Street, Coatbridge, ML5 3LJ. Please keep us in your prayers. Thank you and God bless.